Good afternoon. It's a pleasure for my colleague Alison and I to be here. We are both sociologists and research scholars at the Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab. And today we're going to be talking to you about resilience, two sides of the same coin. And by two sides of the same coin, what we are referring to are the experiences of employees, particularly women and women of color, and D&I programming. So as we share data and share stressors today, what we want you to do is think about the information that we're sharing with you and the strategies that we're going to be discussing at the end. So before we get started, I want to talk about what we're going to be doing today. So first, we're going to be talking about the year in review. What did it mean for coronavirus to happen? How did it affect work? Then we're going to be talking about stressors, define resilience, and at the end, close with strategies and how all of this links to diversity and inclusion programming. So first, COVID and intersectionality. So this is a quote taken from Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal scholar at Columbia University and coined the term intersectionality back in 1989. She stated in a recent podcast episode of last year that the coronavirus did not create the stark social, financial, and political inequalities that define life for so many Americans, but it has made them strikingly more visible than any moment in recent history. Unfortunately, some of the intersectional dimensions of these structural disparities remain undetected and unreported. The reason we're starting with this quote today is because it's been over a year that we've been sheltering in place, working remotely, and the various forms of violence against different racial groups, as well as the rise in deaths and everything related to COVID has done is expose a lot of the inequalities that social scientists have studied for decades, but really made it more visible for your average employee, right? And so when we're thinking about what it means for certain inequalities to be more visible, what it really does is exacerbate certain workplace stressors, right? And so what does all of this mean in terms of how we build resilience and re-enter the workforce, the workplace? Okay, I already did that. So first, I want to discuss changes in the labor market. What I'm showing here is a graph of changes in employment by race and gender across the last 12 months, more specifically between February 2020 and February 2021. And what we see here is a few things. First, proportionately, the hardest hit groups are Black women and Latinx women. And here we can see that while they've over 500,000 in both categories have lost jobs, proportionately, the percentage of their loss of employment with regard to their general populations is highest across all categories, right? Unfortunately, the Asian data did not have enough information to disaggregate men and women, but here what I'm showing is where the state of unemployment is now, what it means in terms of race and gender, right? And to give you a little bit more context in terms of what these numbers mean, I want to show how unemployment rates have changed in the last year. So all of this data is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The last graphic shared was from the White House's annual report on the state of the economy. And so here, right, we're seeing numbers in the last slide that will range from like 4.5% to 3% of the population based on different groups. But overall, the unemployment rate was under 4%. The minute the pandemic hit, it skyrocketed up to almost 16% and has been on the decline ever since, but still hasn't gotten back to pre-COVID numbers. Why does all of this matter? For a few reasons. One, as we saw in the last slide, race and gender matter in terms of how we understand the impact of unemployment. Two, the spike and slow rebound, right, also contributes to stress and how we navigate what's going on in the world today. And I'll pass it over to my colleague, Alison.
Thanks, Melissa. So now we're going to take a moment to focus on another group of women who are particularly impacted by the recent events over the last year, and this is mothers. Almost 1 million mothers have left the workforce, with Black, Hispanic, and single mothers being among the hardest hit. And almost 1 in 4 children experienced food insecurity in 2020, which is heavily related to the loss of maternal income. Almost 70% of mothers say that worry and stress from the pandemic have damaged their health. And up to 40% of US childcare centers and half of those that are minority owned may end up closing permanently. Obviously, we're still not exactly sure what's going to happen, but it looks like a lot of the childcare centers that closed may stay closed permanently. Black and Hispanic pregnant women are also 5 times more likely to be exposed to coronavirus than white pregnant women. And again, these patterns may change as vaccines become more widely available, but we also know that the vaccine rollout has been unequal. And so when we think about these patterns, the gender and the racial inequalities are likely to continue. And some experts estimate that due to all of these things over the last year, the pandemic has set us back a full generation when it comes to gender equity, with childcare responsibilities and elder care responsibilities falling heavily on mothers. And so when we think about what's been going on during the pandemic, the impacts to mothers and to women as a group are going to be longstanding. Next slide, please. And so I'll pass it back over to Melissa now to talk about some of the ways women are building resilience in the workforce and the stressors that they're facing.
Okay, so we've talked about unemployment. We've talked about the impact on mothers. We've brought in race, right? And so we wanted to frame the conversation around unemployment and around some of the challenges that people are facing in their daily lives. Why is this important? Because when we think about resilience, we think about a few things. First, let's start with the definition. And I want you to think about the different ways. There's 3 different versions we're going to be talking about today. And I want you to think about what each of these implies as we go through the stressors after this. So first, resilience is one option is that resilience is a power or ability of a material to return to its original form, position, etc., after being bent, compressed, or stressed, right? When we think about adjusting to working from home, when we think about the added responsibilities of managing multiple family members in a confined space with shoddy internet, right? The question then becomes, this original form, did it actually work? Second idea to think about, right? The ability of a person to adjust or recover readily from illness, adversity, major life changes, etc. We've talked about unemployment. We've talked about the added stress to mothers, right? And we can talk about parents in general, but mothers in particular have really been hit hard by the pandemic and how it's pushed back gender equality efforts. And then lastly, the ability of a system or organization to respond to or recover readily from a crisis, disruptive process, or any other kind of mega event, right? So this can range everything from lost jobs, families getting sick from COVID, families experiencing higher levels of anxiety because of all these different changes happening, right? And I just remember this time last year, we thought we'd be back in the office by the summer. We're here a year later, still wondering when we're going to go back into the office, when it's going to be safe for our kids to go back to school, and all of these things, right? So as we think about these 3 definitions, I want you all to think about, do we want to go back to normal? Was normal good for everyone and everyone we know? Second, this ability to recover, what does it mean, right? The adversity in the workplace to adjusting to the series of changes. We also experienced a presidential shift in the last year and a half, right? It's been coming from all sides. So how are we equipped to recover, both personally and in the workplace? And then lastly, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, especially with all the anti-Black and anti-Asian violence of the last year and a half, right? The ability of a system or organization to respond or recover readily from a crisis, right? And for a lot of us, the events that have been going on across the country have really hit us really hard, right? And we're leaning on our organizations to do something about it.
And that can you go back one slide before you move on? There's just a couple things that I wanted to point out on this slide. One is, as Melissa brought up, the part of the definition of resilience as defined here is the power ability to return to your original form. And I think we all need to be asking ourselves, do we want to return to our original form? Should that be the goal, to return back to the way things were before the pandemic? Is that even possible? And if it is possible, would we want that? Or I think more likely, we're going to transform, not return to an original form, right? We're going to change to something new. We're going to take whatever we learned from the pandemic or whatever we experienced from the pandemic and try to build something different. So as we're thinking about individually and as organizations, what does resilience mean and how do we want to define that? I think we need to be thinking creatively about what the end state is supposed to look like. And then the next 2 parts of this definition are really the 2 sides of the coin that we're discussing today, the individual side of resilience and the organizational side of resilience. And so both of these are part of how we think about resilience post-pandemic and post all of these crises we faced over the last year. We're really thinking about, how can we do this as individuals and how can we do this as organizations?
Thank you. Okay, So we defined it. We've given you 3 options to think about. Now let's think about general stresses in the workplace. And here we've cultivated a list. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's a place to start thinking about, right? My colleague and I, Alison, are at a Women's Leadership Innovation Lab, where we focus particularly in terms of on workforce discrimination and how that shapes the leadership trajectories of women. Me in particular, I focus on women of color, right? So that's one side, and discrimination comes in a variety of forms. Second is financial strain. Again, let's think about a few slides ago, the rate of unemployment, how it's affecting women, and in particular, women of color, right? And what that means when you're managing a household, when in some cases, especially when I think about first generation professionals, not only are you managing your household, but you might be managing extended family members. And then on that note, family dynamics. I was talking to a friend of mine a few weeks ago, right, who's a child of immigrants. And as she's navigating this complex system of vaccination, she's like, I had to sign up my entire family, but thank God I knew how to use technology to do it, right? And so not just in terms of COVID, but the other stories I've heard a lot about in the last year is how do you manage working from home and schooling, like your children being schooled from home, right? And that's just a few things. And then for those of us who are far away from home, right? Like how do I manage staying connected to my family when I can't get on a plane and go see them with all the life changes happening to all of us? Fourth is harassment, right? This comes sexual harassment and other forms of harassment in terms of, especially for women, right? The subtle messaging we get about decisions about having kids, whether we're smart enough to be in the room, whether we're an affirmative action hire, and all of these other things. Lastly, all of these things can lead women to feel isolated, right? And I'm not even bringing up COVID yet, right? Because if we think about all of these things, COVID has made them a lot worse, especially for women of color. I've interviewed over 50 women of color in the last 4 years, talked to several dozens more. And when they tell me their stories of working in tech or other corporate industries, they feel so alone. And it's for me, as I hear their stories and listen to their struggles, to think that they're the only one. I often say, I was like, I interviewed 30 people who all say the same thing, right? And we'll talk about that idea later. And then lastly, all of this is changing in relationships, especially for upwardly mobile women who may be the first professionals in their family, right? What it means to make it, what it means to be able to have workplace flexibility when maybe some of your family members don't. And then lastly, illness and injury, right? We are humans. We deal with a lot at work. We deal with a lot at home. We deal with a lot of relationships. And what this pandemic and other events that have happened in the last year and a half have done is made many of these a lot worse. So I've talked about women. Now let's talk about race, right? The intersection of race and gender is very near and dear to my heart. And I wanted to show this slide for a few reasons. So this is a study done on self-esteem of employees, right? And what it looks at is 3 things: race, socioeconomic status, and self-esteem. Now these 3 line graphs tell us a few things. Now, unfortunately, the study only looks at white employees versus Black employees. It does not include gender at all, unfortunately. But I wanted to introduce these ideas to you because I want you to think about what this means in terms of the list I just shared and some of the stats we shared in the beginning of this presentation. So first, when it comes to education and self-esteem, what we see is a very interesting line graph. So on the one hand, for both Black and white workers, it rises from less than high school degree to having a high school degree or DED. And it dips a little bit for white workers, it dips essentially for Black workers, and then continues to fall for Black workers, but rebounds for white workers when it comes to having a college education. So that's one. And so long story short, Black workers are good when they get high school degrees. The more education they get, the lower their self-esteem. The second line graph, right? It shows income and self-esteem. And again, funny line graph. So with white employees, what you see is it shakes a little bit, it goes up and down. But for Black workers, what you see is it peaks when they're about $35,000 to $55,000, which in the Bay Area, I don't know how you survive on that salary. And then after that, it falls with a big blip once you get to above, I can't even read the number, $95,000, right? So what does this mean? When we think about the small numbers of Black employees or other people of color in your organization, right? Like if making it challenges their self-esteem, that then informs how they show up at work and how they interact with colleagues. The third line graph on this thing really strikes me, and it was really important for me to share with you all because we're talking about the tech sector and many of you are in the tech industry, is that as occupational prestige increases, there are very different effects based on race. So on the one hand, for white employees, it goes up. On the other hand, for Black employees, it goes down, right? So this is just a baseline to understand that race, education, and income inform how people keep their self-esteem, right? And when we think about the events of the last year and the implications this might have for other communities of color, it makes visible how stressful it has been for certain sectors of the labor force. And then this one really got to me, right? So there's one thing to have self-esteem and there's another thing to have social support, right? And social support is crucial for self-esteem, right? I don't know that I could have done this without the regular check-ins with friends and family members. And here, what this measures is a relationship between occupational prestige and social support. And what we see here is something very similar to the last slide of occupational prestige and self-esteem. And that is, as occupational prestige increases for your white employees, so does self-esteem, but Black employees experience something different. And when I think about what I went through, what my friends went through, what social media was telling me Black people across the country were going through, like this taken together, I'm pretty sure had implications for how they show up at work. And why is it important to talk about stressors? Because if we don't name the stressors, we can't talk about how to recover from them, right? How to bounce back. And I'll pass it to Alison.
Great, thanks, Melissa. So coming back to mothers as a group, a majority of mothers say that worry or stress related to coronavirus has affected their mental health. And 1 in 5 say it's had a major impact on their mental health. And one thing I want to call out here is that the same is not true for fathers, right? So fathers as a group are not experiencing the same level of stress or worry as mothers. Women are more likely than men to report that they took on additional caregiving responsibilities due to the pandemic. They were already doing more caregiving than men prior to the pandemic. Now they report taking on more labor during the pandemic. And women are more likely than men to report having taken time off work due to the pandemic. So we can see that the caregiving responsibilities, they were already big before the pandemic, but certainly caregiving increased during the pandemic, and women have been taking on a majority of that labor and everything that involves, including mental health. Next slide.
Okay, so again, we're doing this piecemeal in part because it's hard to design a research study that does all of these factors together, right? And trying to find a study that focuses particularly on COVID is also hard. And we can talk about that later. But anyway, so we've outlined stressors. We've outlined how it relates to occupational prestige. We've outlined how it relates to race, how it relates to motherhood, right? So part of the thing about resilience is being able to share. And this is taken from a study on how people navigate depression at work. Now, what does depression have to do with stress? It's just in the arena of mental health. And as I was going over this with a student, because a student helped us put this presentation together, which was another experiment in and of itself. But as we were talking through, she was like, well, what does this have to do with what you're talking about? I was like, because in the arena of mental health, sharing what we're struggling with is part of the recovery process and part of the healing process. Now, what the study discovered after interviewing 30 employees, there's 3 options. One is non-disclosure. That is, you conceal what you're struggling with. That means you make something else, you attribute it to something else, or you mask your feelings. Then there's partial disclosure, which is this idea that maybe you signal some of the symptoms that you're going through, some of the struggles, but you don't really elaborate on what's going on. Then there's full disclosure, right? Where you're fully transparent on what you're going through. And then you can even take it a step further to even advocate on behalf of the community, like the issue you're dealing with at work, right? So you can replace with depression with racism, sexism, bias, right? But it's all part of the same thing. And again, when I think about the conversations I've had at work, especially with my colleague Alison, about what it means for diversity and inclusion programming, is the challenges women and or women of color and or people of color struggle with, right? It's so hard to name because often they feel like they're the only one. And it's spaces like this that provide us an opportunity to have a conversation and to make visible the challenges that many of us are going through. But if we don't have these spaces, right, what does that mean? My mouse is having issues. Okay, so stressors, pathways towards sharing. Now let's talk about strategies, right? Because resilience is about responding to stress and recovering. And so this is taken from research done on racial trauma. Now, racial trauma is different. You know, people may think, well, it's different. I was like, but trauma is trauma. Right? And the strategies that apply to one form of trauma can easily be translated into other arenas, right? So here we're going to go over a few wound healing strategies and then discuss what they mean for diversity and inclusion programming. So first, it's process of naming, right? Again, when I think about the women I've talked to over the years, or what it means to really name the fact that like what I'm going through is outside of my control, it's a really powerful transition to go from like, it's just me, to being like, this is what's going on, right? So again, the first strategy we want to highlight is the process of naming. After the process of naming is storytelling, right? We've referenced it a few times, right? Once we have the language to talk about what we're going through, then it's a matter of trying to figure out how we tell our story. To what extent do we share the details? To what extent do we feel safe enough to have conversations about the range of struggles? Third is creating a space for identity challenges, right? One of the reasons we love to partner with VMware on this summit is because it really is one of those spaces where we can talk about women-specific challenges in the workplace and talk about strategies to overcome them and be our best professional selves, right? After that is this idea of affirmation, acknowledgement, and validation. When I think about the women of color I've interviewed, oftentimes the only ones on their team, right? One of the most powerful parts about doing the interview is that it's a practice of storytelling, right? And I struggle with the extent to which I name or give them the language to what they're going through, right? Because I understand how powerful and how scary that transition is to let go of like, I can't fix this, especially for high achieving women in the corporate sector who are just used to controlling everything, right? And when you have all of these events that are out of your control, the question is, how am I going to do this? Is there something wrong with me? And to let that go, that control go, and as a control freak myself, is really, really hard. So once we get past the process of naming, of storytelling, and finding those spaces to process identity-based challenges, then it's a matter of creating a space where we can affirm each other, acknowledge that these things are impacting how we take up space, both in our personal lives and at work, and validating those experiences. I'm fortunate enough to work at a feminist organization where I would easily say validating and acknowledging the various forms of stress is part of our daily lives, but I understand that very few workplaces are like that. Now, what does this have to do with diversity and inclusion programming, right? We've talked about mental health, we've talked about stressors, and we've talked a little bit about discrimination and bias and other things, right? And all these sound at surface level as self-care strategies. But Alison studies diversity and inclusion. I study the experiences of women of color. And when we're talking about this, we're like, this sounds a lot like some of the stuff that happens at identity-based networking events, in ERGs, and other forms of programming that center diversity inclusion, right? So with all that in mind, I want you to ask yourselves, is this a self-care strategy, or is this a taken for granted form of invisible labor? And with that said, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Alison.
Thank you, Melissa. Yes, so pivoting a little, we're going to be talking about how do you build resilient diversity and inclusion programs that are not just relying on burdening individual people in your organization, as Melissa described. So, if your organizations are not taking this on, then it does fall on individuals and they're taking on all of these strategies that Melissa talked about. But thinking about how can we build resilient D&I programs that really are helping build resilience among their workforce and are resilient themselves to disruptions and changes and pandemics and everything that's been going on. So next slide, please. So organizations routinely encounter disruptions that can derail diversity and inclusion initiatives. And that's everything from leadership changes or personnel changes, key change agents leaving your organization, some of the research that I've done, to company reorganizations and downsizing, or natural disasters, other external factors, pandemics, right? There's lots of different disruptions that our organizations go through, although certainly the last year has been unprecedented. And so over the past year, companies have weathered a number of crises, as we've discussed at the beginning of the presentation, which affect everything from health to economics to work-life balance. And so we know from existing research that when the going gets tough, D&I programs are often the first to fall, right? They're the first things cut when things get tough for organizations. And we see that companies tend to fall into some common pitfalls when they are designing their D&I programs, which then make programs particularly vulnerable to this disruption. So first, oftentimes a small number of people carry a large load when it comes to all of the diversity and inclusion work that needs to be done in an organization. D&I programs are often fueled primarily by a small number of very dedicated people, sometimes even one really dedicated person. And as Melissa described, these people get burnt out, right? But it also puts the D&I program itself at risk. So if those people leave the organization or they become otherwise engaged, your whole D&I program comes crumbling down. And so your D&I program isn't robust if one person leaving your organization can bring the whole thing crashing down. So you really need to be thinking about spreading responsibility, which we'll talk more about strategies later. But thinking about, is your organization making your D&I program robust, or is it really relying on? Thanks. Yeah. So, and then the next one is culture of individual achievement. So if you have a culture of individualism with individual credit for people's successes and people getting rewarded based on their individual achievements, then it's hard to generate a sense of shared ownership over something like diversity and inclusion, which research has shown really needs to be built into the organization and spread out. Something that it's not seen as just one person fixing, right? It needs to be seen as something that the organization shares. But if your organization doesn't have many shared tasks or shared values, then it's hard to make this one of them. So if think about your performance evaluations, if you're evaluating and rewarding people based on what they individually did and not team projects or team successes, then it's going to be hard to motivate D&I as a shared goal if you already have this system set up where your culture at your organization is really valuing individual achievement. So thinking about building a broader culture of team achievement rather than just focusing on what did you do this year that no one else did that was unique to you. And then third, lip service from leaders without a demonstration that D&I are core values. Obviously, this is, I think, very common among organizations where leaders know they are supposed to talk about the importance of diversity and inclusion, but may not actually be devoting resources to it. They may not be actually holding their direct reports accountable for it, building in accountability structures and metrics and saying, okay, by the end of the quarter, we have to hit this diversity target. How are we doing? And really bringing it up in meetings and making it a priority, both financially, symbolically. And so we really need to be thinking about, are leaders taking these steps to devote resources to diversity and inclusion, to hold their direct reports accountable? Because if they're not, that sends a message to the rest of the organization that diversity and inclusion are not essential. They're not essential. And that leads to that last point of seeing D&I as nice to have rather than essential business priorities. So oftentimes, because diversity and inclusion are seen as, it would be nice if we were diverse and inclusive, but it's not essential to the business. Therefore, diversity and inclusion programs are often the first to get cut when the rubber hits the road, when things get tough. And, this is particularly difficult because when things get tough, that's actually when you need D&I programs the most. That's when you need programs that are focused on employee well-being, focused on making sure your employees are building those resilient, skills, and that they have the resources that they need to deal with everything that's going on. So each of these pitfalls worsen the load of the stressors that Melissa described on the earlier slides. And so we can be thinking about, what are the implications when programs that are designed to alleviate stressors are actually the first to go when things get tough? Next slide, please. So now we'll be talking about, I'm sure you've been waiting all presentation for this, some strategies for both individuals and organizations. What can we be doing to build resilience? Next slide. So really what we're thinking about is, how do individual needs and strategies tie into best practices for organizations? So how can we be thinking about what individuals need and what they're doing, and then how organizations can enable and empower that? So starting with storytelling, as Melissa described, individuals need to be able to share what's going on for them. They need to be able to make sense of their own experiences. They need to be able to share with their colleagues and their leaders. They need to be able to talk honestly about what they're experiencing, both as individuals, just what's going on in their lives, but also as members of a group, as part of a group identity. So they need to be able to talk about this openly. And so organizations need to create space for that storytelling to happen, whether it's thinking about how you design team meetings, So I know at our lab, we've built in time for check-ins, and we've experimented with different ways of doing check-ins. Do we do check-ins with the whole lab? Do we do breakout rooms and do smaller check-ins? So we're kind of experimenting with how do we create this space for members of your organization to share what's going on for them in an honest, authentic way that really meets that need for them. And I've also seen a lot of organizations doing, having great success with anonymous surveys. So especially if your organization's really big, giving people a chance on surveys to say how they're feeling and getting a sense of, what's going on for your workforce, and having that bubble up to leaders and saying, hey, this % of your workforce is having mental health challenges, or, this is getting better or worse over time. So, surveys can be a great way to kind of, some organizations have done like pulse surveys, quick surveys, even just 1 or 2 questions. How are you feeling today? Right. But giving employees a chance to say what's up, and, then using that to, let's say, give employees resources if they're not not feeling good, and, then thinking as an organization of how you can respond to that. But really think about what opportunities are you giving employees to bring their whole selves to work and communicate what's going on for them and what they need. Next bullet, please. So then next point is recentering the human. And I've talked a lot with Melissa about this over the last couple of weeks, but often in the workforce, and especially in technology, which is the focus of a lot of our research, we tend to think of technology work as opposite of human, right? There's tech and there's human, and they're opposite. But actually, when we think about our organizations and our companies, people are doing the work, and like the work is getting done through the people. That's how all of this happens. And so we really need to have a human-centered focus at the center of all this, and be thinking about how are people building our organizations and making our products and doing everything. And so in terms of the organizational side of that, I think this really relates to the idea that I mentioned on the previous slide of diffusing responsibility for diversity and inclusion work, or indeed really for any essential work that your organization has to do, not relying on 1 or 2 or a small group of people to be doing all of the essential labor for your organization. Because not only will you be burning those people out, but you're also then putting your programs at risk by relying heavily on just a few people. So if you're recentering the human in your D&I programs, then you're going to be thinking about how can we build robust programs that aren't relying solely on 1 or 2 or a small group of people. How can we be building this into the way all of our employees and all of our leaders do business? How can we create accountability structures and processes that everyone has to follow? So everyone is part of our D&I story. Everyone's part of our D&I narrative and our D&I effort. This doesn't fall to just a few people to fix it for the whole organization. And so not only will diffusing responsibility be better for the humans in your organization, but by not burning them out, but it'll also be more effective for your D&I programming by making it more stable and more sustainable. And I'll turn it over to Melissa to talk about the last points there.
Thank you. And thank you for your patience with my slippery fingers. Okay. So part of recentering the human is recentering the social emotional. Again, like building on what Alison said in terms of this assumed practice of tech is different from human, right? When we recenter the human, we give space for people to talk about their feelings. It's been really interesting for me personally to be part of in California, because I feel like it's a very common practice to talk about mental health, like normalize the practice of discussing mental health. But the question is how do we bring that in the workspace, right? And one way to do that is to reflect on team culture. Alison shared practices we engaged at our research lab to like do check-ins, right? Is there space to do check-ins in your team, right? Again, none of us expected this to last this long. And we still don't know when we're going back, right? And so how do we create a space in our teams, in our colleague relationships to recenter the social emotional? Because managing the rate of productivity with changes in like home dynamics, the fact that we literally cannot break up from work, in some cases, work from home, right? Like that, all of that melding of boundaries just makes things a little bit difficult, right? So how do we create that space in the teamwork culture and how we engage with our colleagues? And then lastly, going back to this idea of validations. Our feelings are real, they're valid, right? How do we make sure that we see other people's feelings as valid? How do we validate the fact that these stresses do affect the rate at which we produce, the rate at which we engage? The emotional roller coaster of the last 14 months has been intense, right? I have some good days and some days I'm just like, you know what? I got up today. That's my win for the day. And I'm lucky enough to work in an organization that meets me where I'm at with that, right? Like the constant check-in of feelings of what we can produce, of how we can engage, right? Really makes me feel safe and probably encourages more productivity than not, right? Which leads us to our last point. Right? Employee well-being is a business imperative. Again, as we're discussing this, right? What does mental health have to do with D&I? We're not saying D&I should be responsible for mental health programs, but what we are saying is that effective D&I programming is part of a larger ecosystem where organizations can get involved and invest in their employee well-being, right? Because a happy, healthy employee is a productive employee and is an employee who wants to stay at the organization. So as we move into Q&A, we want you to think about these strategies at the individual level, the strategies at the organizational level, to then have a conversation about how we can create change in our workplaces. Thank you.
That was great. I feel like I have so many thoughts. Anyway, so we do have a couple of questions. The first one, a lot of the experience happens at the team level. What skills did you think managers need to have to foster and sustain resilience for employees?
Yeah, I think, a lot of, it's funny how much of D&I just relates to being a good manager or a good leader, right? Like, I think a lot of what makes a manager a good manager is also going to make them good at this. But obviously managers are being put I want to just acknowledge managers are being put in an unprecedentedly difficult position, over the past year with everyone suddenly working from home, many in organizations that did not support work from home prior to this. I've heard from companies that said, we were not a work from home culture at all, and we've had to. So managers are being put in that position. And then of course, dealing with the pandemic itself and people getting sick, and then, dealing with police brutality. I mean, managers have had to deal with a lot. So I first just want to acknowledge, like, it's hard, and, it's okay for it to be hard. That said, I do think that there's a lot that managers can do for their teams, and managers are actually in a really unique position, as this question reflects, to be able to impact their teams. A lot of this does, I think, happen at the manager level. And I think it's a lot of, some of what we've talked about in this presentation in terms of creating space for employees to be able to share what's going on for them. As Melissa brought up, creating space for employees to not be okay sometimes, to have off days, to have days where they're busy with childcare or elder care, or just facing mental health issues or whatever it is. I think that, as managers and as organizations, if we can let go of the you have to be productive every second of every day assumption, we'll actually see a lot more productivity if we can allow employees to have their ebbs and flows and their cycles. And I think also creating more communication amongst the team is going to be good. So Leslie Perlow has some great research. She wrote a book, Sleeping with Your Smartphone, a number of years ago. And what she found was, even in these really high intensity work cultures, people can take time off as long as the team is communicating really well, so that when one person steps back, another team member can step in, and you have this increased communication amongst the team, and an assumption built in that everyone's going to take time off for something at some point, right? Like, we're all in and out. We all have things that we have to do, whether or not we have children. We all have, outside lives, outside work. And so there's an assumption in the team that everyone's going to be, taking time off every now and then. And so being able as a team to respond to that. And I think, if we increase communication, I think actually being virtual, it makes this harder in some ways, but it actually makes it easier in others, because now we have all these digital tools that we've gotten used to. I know our team has been, using Trello a lot more than maybe we did prior to the pandemic. But, Zoom, Trello, I mean, all of these things, all of these tools enable more communication, more real-time communication between teams. And so I think if we're able to increase communication among the team, and the manager can really be facilitating that, then it's more okay for people to come in and out. And, hey, I'm not going to be there this day, but someone else on the team can pick up right where I left off and finish this, task. So I think that's another thing, but I think the most important thing managers can do is honestly just create space for people to be people, and to make it okay and not as scary for people to share what's going on for them and to state their needs openly, and just be, listening to that as managers, and able to, thinking about the best ways to respond to your team and what's going on with your people, because everyone's going to be facing something a little bit different right now.
The other thing, I just want to add one thing to answer that question is, like, managers should also do check-ins with themselves, right? Like, what resources do you need? What resources will help you create the space that Alison has just described, right? Because if you're not there for yourself, you can't be there for other people. So
true. You made a comment that programs that are good for resilience get canceled. What are some of the specific programs you have seen that really do work?
Well, I urge you to stay tuned for our practitioner. This is a little plug, I guess, but our lab is doing a practitioner showcase in June where we're actually going to be detailing a bunch of the programs that we've seen at organizations and what's made them successful, and really detailing step by step how organizations set up these programs and what they've been doing. So I definitely urge you to stay. That's going to be in late June. So stay tuned for some very specific examples of what works. But I think, high level, a lot of the strategies that we've outlined here are things that will make your program resilient. So making sure that responsibility is diffused throughout your organization. I've seen it be very successful at organizations that really actively assign people in different departments to be doing D&I work. So it's not just HR, or it's not just, one particular group. Obviously, those are very important to involve too, but making sure that executives throughout different departments are looped in, that they're part of the D&I activities, the D&I tasks, what's going on. And then also leaders having a really active role in making sure that they're stating the importance of this, but not just stating it, also devoting resources to it. Also, as I said, bringing it up in meetings, asking their direct reports, hey, what have you done this week, this month? How far are we on our D&I metrics? And really holding people accountable for achieving that, as much as they would hold their team accountable for sales metrics or for other bottom line metrics, right? Like making sure this is built in into the way you do business, and it really is a value that you're not just stating, but also demonstrating in your daily activities is important. So I think all of those things will make your D&I program more resilient, so that when things get tough, it's not easily cut. It's now built into the fabric of the way you do business.
Great. One more question. How do we value those who foster resilience in organizational practices in teams in the how of work? Have you seen companies recognize employees who are builders of resilient human organizations? Thinking about performance reviews, what gets people promoted, et cetera. Sort of an add-on.
Sure. Yeah. I don't think it's built into enough. I could do a whole session on performance evaluations. We have a bunch of research from our lab on that topic. And I certainly, once you get me talking about it, I could talk about it a while. I think we definitely have a long way to go when it comes to things like performance evaluations and really understanding how to evaluate people fairly, properly. And so, no, I don't think there's nearly enough to, let's say, reward the people who are doing D&I work. I don't see a lot of that happening on the performance evaluation side. But I think even on the more general, like, are people valued for their labor? I don't even feel like that's happening in a lot of organizations. I think that's part of what I think we wanted to highlight here is the burnout of the people whose shoulders this generally falls on, right? I don't think they are valued enough in their organizations, the people who are doing the diversity and inclusion labor for their organizations. A lot of the time, I remember a quote from actually your research, Melissa, so you may be able to speak to this better, but of someone who, like, no one knew what they were doing until they left. There was this woman who was doing all this work for her organization, all this, and really like expert high level work, and then left. And no one really even knew or understood what she was doing until she left, and no one was doing that work anymore. And then they said, oh no, like, we don't know how to do this code that you were working on. And I think that happens with a lot of the people who are, because I think that woman was also doing a lot. I mean, in addition to the tech work that wasn't being valued, she was also doing a lot of recruiting and a lot of things, D&I specific efforts that were not getting recognized. So I think this labor does not get recognized nearly enough. And so when people get burnt out and leave the organization, then all of a sudden there's this huge hole where that work was and isn't getting done anymore.
Yeah, thanks for the amplification. But yes, it was a computer scientist who developed code and then was also doing all this stuff to diversify her organization. And they didn't treat her with respect. She hit a glass ceiling. She was like, I'm talented. I'll take my talent elsewhere. And they couldn't fix the code that she created, right? And this is just one of several examples of the extent to which many women of color do not experience psychological safety, right? And if they don't experience psychological safety in the workplace, right? And at the center of it for many of my respondents was having their technical expertise respected, right? They're not just there to color your organization, pun intended. They're there to do so much more, right? And so it's a question of like, and I had this conversation with Stanford students all the time. If you want to be an engineer, be an engineer. And so many of them, yeah, but I need to do D&I because I want to make it safe. I was like, and part of me channels my mother. I'm like, did your parents send you to like Stanford to be an engineer to then become a diversity professional? Like, that's not right. And not to say, right, it's not important work, right? But again, going back to the question earlier about things that are canceled, D&I in the research that we've done is usually the last thing to be added to an organization and the first thing to go when things get rough. And as the work we're doing at the lab has demonstrated, this is crucial to employee well-being in the workplace, right? In terms of how they create spaces to have these conversations. And so it's really a question of like, how you recognize the talent in the room and the different forms of talent. These are the questions that are central to the research I've been conducting for the last 4 years at the lab. But it's really like, just because you're a person of color, just because you're a woman, doesn't mean that you're automatically going to be concerned about D&I questions. Oftentimes it's not. And when I think about the conversations I've had in the last year to talk to technical women, women of color who are like, I need to do this. I was like, I'm sorry, why? Like, are they compensating for this labor? Because you're about to like walk into this like anti-racist, like performative wokeness, to be clear. And the question is like, I appreciate why you're doing this. I appreciate this is a time, but I didn't want them to do the work and not get compensated for it. Because eventually, because this work will make your organization look good, which will then help probably diversify your organization. And so if you're not benefiting from it, and oftentimes these women will be like, no, but I really care. And I was like, I appreciate that. And I understand that's also part of your survival strategy. But at the same time, like, are you being taken advantage of? And again, going back to the example Alison shared, it's like the minute my respondent saw, they're like, oh, they're taking me for granted, right? And this varies. And it takes a lot of women a long time to see that they're being taken for granted because they're so excited about the work, right? Like, it's just so cool. They're like, oh, wait, I don't have to do this. And the minute that switch flips, they start looking for another job, right? And the number of conversations I've had with women of color over the last year as a result of this, right? In this space of like, wait, I don't want to do this anymore. What can I do for me, right? Like, the work they took to get there, the work they took to give themselves permission to make the change is really real. So to keep your talent, to keep these people who are making your organizations better, just recognize what they're doing and recognize what they want to do in your organization.
That's great. I don't see another question, but while I wait for a moment to see if we get more questions, actually, could you tell the audience a little bit about the lab and what you do? Because you said, stay tuned, and I'm sitting there going, well, they're not going to hear about it necessarily here on Whova. So how can people get more involved and access some of this terrific research?
So we've been around, I don't know, what, 7 years, Alison? 8? I can't remember the name because I've only been there before. We work with companies. We're funded in part through a corporate affiliates program. And so we put on webinars where we showcase the research and showcase conversations, right? So if your company's in our corporate affiliates program, you will have access to this webinar, Practitioner Showcase that Alison mentioned. And so, yes. And so, but what we do on a day-to-day basis is just study the challenges women face in the corporate sector with a particular lens to tech, right? And so it ranges everything from, and it's funny that you mentioned performance evaluations because like a bunch of translation pieces just came out. One of them in, I think, the Stanford Graduate Business School, and we've tweeted about it all morning. But anyway, that actually looks at performance evaluation. So we look at hiring, recruitment, retention. Nice, thanks. As well as like the career trajectories of women of color, right? So we look at both the individual experiences and organizational practices with the hopes of translating our lessons from research to help organizations improve gender parity. So, yeah.
Yes, I happen to have a slide. Is it working? Can you see it?
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah. So are you seeing it? Is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, so our lab, I can share a little bit about our corporate program too. So we have a lot of member organizations, and as Melissa said, our real goal, I think, is to have cutting edge research applied to real world challenges around creating inclusive workplaces, fostering innovation, and developing leadership. So we really do partner with organizations to put together all of our offerings. So toolkits, videos, curated research, We have, meetings. We used to have them in person twice a year. Now we're doing, virtual content and sharing between members. So as I mentioned, the Practitioner Showcase that we're doing in June is really about the organizations themselves talking about the programs that they're running and what made them successful. And we'll have, we actually have some past practitioner showcases that you can look at as well. And the information is at the bottom for our, our website and email. But I would say what our lab is really about is bringing together research and practice and bridging that often gap. A lot of the time, academic researchers aren't really speaking to organizations and understanding what they actually need or how to make the research actionable. A lot of the time, it's hard for organizations. I mean, they're not going to have access to journal articles. And even if they do, these articles are not written to be easily consumed. So a lot of what our lab is doing is trying to be that bridge and make research actionable and understand how can we take best practices from research and make them best practices in action.
Sounds great. So we do have one more question, and I think that will take us to time. If you were going to tell employees to do one thing for women of color as we are coming out of the pandemic, what is your advice?
Google something before you ask them. And read at least 3 sources.
Oh, I like that. No, it was what we were chatting about earlier.
We were just right. And
Yes.
And like, I did a panel for an organization last month, and it's just like, there are women of color who don't want to talk about race. They just don't, and they don't have the language, and they don't, right? Like, I've spent over a decade studying this. So there's language I have to describe certain things. And just because you look a certain way doesn't mean you know how to explain it, right? And I think for those people who don't spend years and years learning the vocabulary and learning the practices, like, it's overwhelming to all of a sudden get tasked to like fix the problem, right? So Google it, look up the experts, look up the people who like know how to do this, and then ask them, how do you need support, right? That if you're gonna ask them anything is, how can I support you right now? But Google things and then ask that.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I would add to that I think, some of what we've talked about is probably what I would recommend, making sure that the organization is taking on some of this labor that right now is just sort of falling by default onto women of color, because as Melissa said, it's a survival strategy often for them. And so, I would be looking for organizations to be taking that on in terms of, first of all, just responding to events, current events. Oftentimes you'll get like these bland statements from leaders following some crisis. And it seems like they care about it for a week, if that, maybe just a couple of days. And then it fades back into the background and it just never becomes anything. And so I would be looking for organizations to, be building in some diversity and inclusion programs and expectations and metrics into the way they do business. Again, when you think about from recruiting and hiring through, performance evaluations and promotions at every step of the employee life cycle, asking the question, how can we make the experience better for marginalized groups, for women of color, for, everyone. And so, I think that would be that's not really one thing that I would recommend. I guess that's a set of things, but yeah.
There are many things. Well, we do have another question, and I think this might be our last one. How can we help bring women, especially women of color and mothers, back into our workplaces? But I really think this encompasses all women, because so many women, between companies downsizing, and it often seems that women go first, as well as DEI, especially DEI women, obviously.
Yeah, I think my biggest response to this is, don't expect things to go back to normal. I get so viscerally freaked out when I see the articles about the return to normal. I have a kid turning 4 this year, and that terrifies me because he can't get vaccinated yet. He probably won't for a long time. Schools are going to continue to be closing down when there are new outbreaks. I mean, this is not over for me just because I can get vaccinated and my husband can get vaccinated. So for mothers, especially, I think for everyone, don't just expect things to return to normal, or the companies that are saying we're going to return in the fall. It's understand that this pandemic is not over. A lot of people have family in India, in Brazil. I mean, people are dealing with all kinds of things, not to mention the fact that racial inequality hasn't gone anywhere. And we're still seeing police brutality happening now. So this is not over. And we're still seeing a lot of violence as people continue to gather or start gathering again. There's more outbreaks of violence, there's more shootings. So I get very scared when people talk about the return to normal, because it's not happening anytime soon. If there's ever a return to normal, but it's certainly not happening soon for a lot of us who have, these other factors that are still going on. And so, maybe white men who can get vaccinated can return to normal. The rest of us can't yet. And so, I think my biggest piece of advice is just recognize that people are still dealing with the pandemic and all of the unfolding crises. It's not over. So you're still going to have to account for virtual work going forward. You are. I mean, there's just no way you can bring everybody back in the fall. You can't expect to do that. So continue to be building flexibility, continue to be building mental health resources, continue all the things that you've had to do during the pandemic to cope with it. Don't just cut it because you think everyone's going to be back to normal this fall. You're going to have to expect to have some kind of hybrid model or some kind of programming going forward for people who are still dealing with the crisis.
This question always makes me think of when I studied abroad, right? And the culture shock, right? So there's, and whether it's studying abroad or moving, like an international migration, right? When you come into a new space, you have to learn a new set of rules. We've been at this a year. So there's practices that we have all developed to survive this year and change of insecurity that are now going to have to change. We'll have to change again when we re-enter the workforce, right? And when we change our practices, certain things become visible, certain things that bother us, certain things that were uncomfortable, whether personally or at work. And so I say all this to say, slow down, which is hard in tech because tech wants to go like this and wants to do it 12-hour days. And giving, again, going back to the recentering the human, recentering the social emotional, give people time to acclimate. Mm-hmm. I don't know what better metaphor it is than the process of reentry or the process of migration in terms of understanding how to give people room to adjust. People are not normal is not an option. There are those of us who know that normal wasn't okay to begin with, right? And so when we're managing all of these values and all of these shocks and all of these transitions, it's just take a minute and be patient.
Yeah. Well, I think we all have seen, because whoever expected that we would all be thrilled to get a vaccination? People dance. When I went for my second one, people were dancing in line. They were like, I'm so happy, So yeah, this is not the same world that we lived in a year ago. I think that wraps it up. We're finished our questions. Thank you, ladies, both so much. This has been a wonderful session. I've learned a lot. I learn in every session that we have here. I do want to ask our audience, please rate this session. We appreciate you coming, and we will see you all at the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.